444 million years ago, the oceans died. Not completely, of course. Life has a way of clinging to existence even in the worst circumstances, finding refuge in forgotten corners where conditions remain barely tolerable. But if you could have stood on the shores of that ancient Earth, watching the waves roll in across the continental shelves, you would have noticed something deeply wrong. The water at your feet would have been clearer than any ocean you have ever seen, and that clarity would have told you everything. Clear water means empty water. It means the countless tiny organisms that usually cloud the seas with their bodies, their waste, their endless cycles of eating and being eaten, have vanished. It means the food web has collapsed. This was the aftermath of the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, the second greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life on Earth. 85% of all marine species had been erased in what amounted to a geological instant, 2 pulses of death separated by perhaps 1 million years, which is nothing when measured against the vast expanses of deep time. The first pulse came with ice. Massive glaciers spread across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, locking up so much water that sea levels plummeted and the shallow marine environments where most life thrived simply disappeared. Creatures that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years found themselves stranded in a world that no longer had room for them. Then came the second pulse, and this one arrived with warmth. As the glaciers retreated and the seas rose again, you might expect life to have breathed a sigh of relief. Instead, the warming triggered something far more sinister. The oceans became stratified, with warm surface waters trapping cold, oxygen-depleted water below. Vast regions of the seafloor turned anoxic, completely devoid of the oxygen that complex life requires. In some areas, the chemistry shifted toward euxinea, a condition where hydrogen sulfide, the same compound that gives rotten eggs their smell, accumulated in toxic concentrations. The seas themselves had turned poisonous. The victims read like a census of Ordovician life. Trilobites, those armored arthropods that had dominated the seafloors for over 100 million years, lost entire families in the space of a few thousand generations. Brachiopods, the shellfish that had carpeted continental shelves in densities we can barely imagine today, saw their diversity collapse. Bryozoans, graptolites, corals, crinoids, every major group felt the scythe pass through their ranks. The reef communities that had been building complexity since the Cambrian were devastated, their intricate structures crumbling as the organisms that built them died. And yet, when the killing finally stopped and the chemistry of the oceans began to stabilize, the survivors did something unexpected. They did not merely cling to existence in diminished numbers, waiting for better days. They began, almost immediately, to expand. The empty niches left by the extinct were like vacant apartments in a city after a plague, and the remaining tenants wasted no time moving into the abandoned spaces. Brachiopod genera that had been confined to the margins of Laurentia spread across the globe within a few million years. Corals that had barely survived began to diversify, their descendants laying foundations for reef systems that would rival anything the Ordovician had produced. This period of recovery and transformation would come to be called the Silurian, named after an ancient Celtic tribe from the borderlands of Wales, where rocks of this age were first studied. It would last approximately 24 million years, brief by geological standards, barely a chapter in the long book of Earth's history. But what a chapter it would be! In the seas, fish would develop jaws for the first time, a transformation that seems almost mundane until you realize that every vertebrate mouth since then, including yours, inherited that innovation. Giant arthropods called Eurypterids would grow to lengths of 2.5 meters, becoming the largest arthropods that have ever lived. Apex predators in a world still recovering from catastrophe. And on land, something even more revolutionary was stirring. For 4 billion years, the continents had been essentially barren. Rock, sand, and silence, under a sky that offered no protection from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. But the Silurian atmosphere was changing, oxygen levels rising, and with them the ozone layer that would finally make terrestrial life possible. Tiny plants no taller than your finger began to colonize the edges of streams and estuaries, their vascular tissues representing an engineering solution that would eventually cover the earth in green. Behind them came the arthropods, millipedes and centipedes, and the ancestors of spiders, the first animals to breathe air and walk on land without the need to return to water. We will follow all of these stories in the hours ahead. The rise of the reefs, the giants of the ancient seas, the jaw revolution, the greening of the land. If that sounds like a journey worth taking, I hope you will settle in and stay with us. There is something uniquely peaceful about letting deep time wash over you, about following the slow rhythms of evolution as they played out across millions of years. Consider this your invitation to rest, to listen, and to let the ancient world carry you wherever you need to go tonight. The warming seas of the early Silurian stretched across continental shelves far broader and shallower than anything in the modern world. Sea levels, swollen by melting glaciers, had risen dramatically, flooding the low-lying interiors of continents and creating vast empyric seas that penetrated hundreds of kilometers inland. In these warm, well-lit waters, conditions were perfect for life to flourish once more. Sunlight reached the bottom, fueling photosynthesis. Nutrients cycled through the water column, supporting the base of new food webs. And into this welcoming environment, the survivors spread and multiplied, generation after generation, species after species, filling the emptiness with movement and color and the endless business of living. But before we can fully understand what the Silurian would become, we must first understand the stage upon which this drama unfolded. The continents of this ancient Earth bore no resemblance to the familiar shapes on modern maps. They were scattered across the globe in configurations that would seem alien to us, separated by oceans that no longer exist, drifting toward collisions that would build mountain ranges still visible today. In one of those collisions, two pieces of land that had been separated for hundreds of millions of years would finally meet, and in that meeting, Scotland would join England for the first time, though neither name would exist for another 400 million years. The story of the Silurian is written in stone, in fossils, in the chemistry of ancient rocks that still outcrop in Wales and Sweden and the American Midwest. It is a story of death and rebirth, of a world that emerged from catastrophe not merely restored, but transformed. In the chapters that follow, we will trace that story from the empty seas of the extinction's aftermath to the first footsteps on dry land, from the armored fish of the ancient oceans to the giant predators that hunted them, from the collision of continents to the quiet revolution that would eventually lead to every forest and meadow on the modern Earth. This is the Silurian period, as we understand it. The recovery began in the shallows, along the margins of Laurentia, in warm waters that lapped against what is now the eastern edge of North America. Life was stirring again within a few 100,000 years of the extinction's end. This seems impossibly fast to us, accustomed as we are to thinking of evolution as a process that unfolds over timescales beyond human comprehension. But the survivors were working with something they had never had before: empty space. The niches were vacant. The competitors were dead. The predators that had kept populations in check for millions of years had vanished, and the organisms that remained found themselves in a world where the only limit to expansion was how fast they could reproduce. In Laurentia, diversity bounced back to pre-extinction levels within roughly 5 million years. 5 million years is a long time by human standards, enough to take us from the present day back to when our ancestors were just beginning to walk upright on the African savanna. but in the slow calendar of geology, 5 million years barely registers, hardly enough time for sediments to accumulate into recognizable rock layers. Globally, the process took longer, perhaps 15 million years before the world's oceans reached the same levels of biodiversity they had known before the killing started. Some regions had been hit harder than others, and the survivors in those devastated areas had further to climb. Rebuilding complex food webs required more than just filling empty niches with warm bodies. The intricate relationships between species, the dependencies connecting predator to prey to the microorganisms that recycle their waste, all of these had to be re-established through countless generations of trial and error. Yet perhaps the most striking change was not in the speed of recovery, but in its character. The Ordovician world had been a patchwork of distinct biological provinces, each continent hosting its own unique assemblage of species that had evolved in isolation over tens of millions of years. A brachiopod living on the seafloor near what is now Morocco would have looked nothing like its distant cousins in Laurentia. The extinction changed that. When 85% of species disappear, the survivors are not a random sample of what existed before. They tend to be generalists, organisms with broad tolerances and flexible lifestyles that allowed them to endure conditions that killed their more specialized neighbors. These generalists spread rapidly across the recovering world once the crisis passed, their descendants colonizing environments from the tropics to the poles. The highly endemic faunas of the Ordovician gave way to something far more cosmopolitan, as if life had wiped the slate clean and started over with a more standardized toolkit. You can see this pattern clearly in the brachiopods, those shelled creatures that superficially resemble clams but belong to an entirely different branch of the animal family tree. Before the extinction, brachiopod communities varied dramatically from region to region, shaped by millions of years of local adaptation. Afterward, a handful of surviving lineages spread across the globe with striking speed. The pentamerids underwent an explosive radiation in the early Silurian, their thick-shelled descendants appearing in similar environments on nearly every continent, but with an interesting twist. These new pentamerids were consistently smaller than their Ordovician ancestors, a pattern known as the Lilliput effect that appears again and again in the aftermath of mass extinctions. When the future is uncertain and resources are scarce, evolution favors the small, the quick to mature, the economical. The brachiopods were rebuilding their dynasty, but they were not working alone. Across the shallow continental shelves, other survivors were getting to work on something even more ambitious: the physical architecture of marine ecosystems. The Ordovician had seen reef communities reach impressive levels of complexity, with corals, sponges, bryozoans, and dozens of other groups constructing three-dimensional habitats that sheltered countless smaller organisms. The extinction had demolished these living structures, leaving behind rubble fields where intricate ecosystems had once thrived. Now, in the warming Silurian seas, new builders were laying foundations that would eventually surpass anything the Ordovician had produced. Stromatoporoids led the reconstruction. These calcareous sponges had survived the extinction in diminished numbers, but the empty shelves offered them room to expand. They grew in layers, each generation building upon the calcified remains of the last, creating dome-shaped and branching structures that accumulated over thousands of years into masses the size of small hills. Alongside them, tabulate corals, colonial animals that built honeycomb-like skeletons of calcium carbonate, began establishing themselves in the sunlit shallows. If you could have visited those early Silurian reefs, you would have found them modest compared to what would come later, but the groundwork was being laid for reef systems that would eventually stretch for hundreds of kilometers along continental margins. Other survivors played less conspicuous but equally essential roles in rebuilding the marine world. Crinoids, those graceful filter feeders sometimes called sea lilies for their flower-like appearance, had weathered the extinction better than most, with roughly 70% of their genera making it through to the other side. In the Silurian, they spread across continental shelves around the world, their feathery arms waving in the currents, capturing tiny particles of food and cycling nutrients through the water column. Graptolites continued their slow decline from Ordovician heights, but these colonial organisms remained important members of the planktonic community, and their distinctive saw-blade fossils would prove invaluable to geologists trying to date Silurian rocks hundreds of millions of years later. And then there were the trilobites, those armored arthropods whose fossilized remains span over 300 million years of Earth history. The extinction had hit them hard, erasing entire families and reducing their once great diversity to a fraction of what it had been. They would never truly recover. The Silurian trilobites were survivors of a dynasty in decline, holding on in a world that was slowly moving past them. Yet if you had walked the sea floors of Silurian Laurentia, you would still have seen them everywhere, scuttling across the sediment with their compound eyes scanning for food and danger. Calimene, with its tightly enrolled defensive posture, would become so common in Wisconsin that it would eventually be named the state fossil, a reminder of the shallow tropical seas that once covered the American Midwest. These patterns of recovery, generalists replacing specialists, cosmopolitan faunas replacing endemic ones, small bodies appearing where large ones had thrived, would repeat themselves after every major extinction in Earth's history. Life, it seems, has a playbook for rebuilding after catastrophe, a set of strategies that work regardless of whether the crisis was caused by glaciers or volcanoes or asteroids. But the Silurian recovery was more than just a repetition of familiar patterns. Even as the survivors were filling the empty spaces left by the dead, something unprecedented was stirring in the depths of this post-apocalyptic world. In the gill arches of certain fish, cartilage was bending in new directions, hinting at structures that would eventually become jaws. On the barren continents, where ultraviolet radiation still made the surface deadly to complex life, oxygen was slowly accumulating in the atmosphere, building toward a threshold that would change everything. And in the shallow waters near the shore, tiny organisms were beginning to experiment with something that had never been tried before: life outside the sea. The recovery from extinction had become something else entirely. It had become a revolution. The continents of the Silurian would have been unrecognizable to modern eyes. If you could have looked down at Earth from space 430 million years ago, you would have searched in vain for the familiar shapes of Africa, the Americas, the sprawling mass of Eurasia. Instead, you would have seen a planet dominated by water, with land masses scattered across the globe in configurations that bear no resemblance to any modern map. The southern hemisphere was occupied by an enormous supercontinent called Gondwana, a fusion of what would eventually become Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, India, and fragments of southern Europe. It stretched from the South Pole northward past the equator, a continuous mass of land larger than any continent existing today. Gondwana was not alone in this ancient world. Near the equator, basking in tropical warmth, sat Laurentia, a continent that included most of modern North America, Greenland, and a piece of what is now Scotland. The rocks that would one day form the Scottish Highlands were separated from the rocks of England by thousands of kilometers of open ocean, a fact that still surprises people who assume Great Britain has always been a single geological unit. Laurentia's position in the tropics meant that its shallow continental shelves were bathed in warm, sunlit waters, creating ideal conditions for the reef communities that were beginning to rebuild after the extinction. To the east of Laurentia, across a narrowing stretch of water called the Iapetus Ocean, another continent was slowly approaching. Baltica comprised most of Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and portions of Eastern Europe, and throughout the Silurian it was rotating and drifting toward an inevitable collision with its larger neighbor. Between them, like a small boat caught between two converging ships, sat Avalonia, a slender microcontinent that had rifted away from Gondwana tens of millions of years earlier and was now drifting northward. Avalonia carried with it the rocks that would become England, Wales, southeastern Ireland, and parts of eastern Newfoundland, geological fragments that would eventually be sutured onto larger landmasses as the oceans between them closed. The Iapetus Ocean was dying. For hundreds of millions of years, it had separated Laurentia from Baltica, an Atlantic-sized body of water with its own distinct marine communities and its own patterns of circulation. But the forces that drive continental drift were pushing these land masses together at rates of a few centimeters per year, slow by human standards, but relentless over geological time. By the late Silurian, the Iapetus had narrowed to a fraction of its former width, and the collision that would close it entirely was already beginning. This collision would build mountains. As Baltica and Avalonia pressed against Laurentia, the crust crumpled and folded, forcing rock upward into ranges that may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. Geologists call this mountain-building episode the Caledonian Orogeny, and its effects are still visible today in the highlands of Scotland, the mountains of Scandinavia, the hills of Wales, and the northern reaches of the Appalachians. When you hike through the Scottish Highlands, you are walking on the eroded roots of mountains that rose when continents collided more than 400 million years ago, monuments to a world that no longer exists. The collision also brought together pieces of land that had evolved separately for hundreds of millions of years. Scotland, riding on the edge of Laurentia, finally met England, which had travelled northward on Avalonia. The suture between them, a geological boundary called the Iapetus Suture, runs roughly along the line of the modern border between Scotland and England, though it passes through Ireland as well. Two pieces of land with completely different geological histories, hosting completely different fossil assemblages, were welded together into what would eventually become a single island. The next time someone tells you that Scotland and England have always been part of the same country, you can point out that for most of Earth's history, they were on opposite sides of an ocean. While continents collided in some regions, they remained scattered elsewhere. Siberia drifted alone in the northern hemisphere, separated from other major land masses by vast stretches of the Panthalassic Ocean. The South China and North China blocks existed as separate entities, not yet joined to each other or to anything else. These isolated continents developed their own distinct marine faunas, though the cosmopolitan nature of Silurian life meant that similar species often appeared in similar environments, regardless of which continental shelf they inhabited. The global geography of the Silurian had profound implications for ocean circulation, climate, and the distribution of life. With so much land concentrated in the southern hemisphere, the northern polar region was dominated by open ocean, the vast Panthalassic Ocean that covered nearly half the planet. This configuration allowed warm equatorial currents to flow relatively freely around the globe, distributing heat and moderating temperatures. The result was a world that was, on average, warmer than today, with shallow seas flooding the low-lying interiors of continents and creating vast expanses of habitat for marine life. These flooded continental interiors were called epiric seas, and they were unlike anything in the modern world. Imagine the entire Mississippi River Valley filled with warm, shallow seawater stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay. During the Silurian, something similar actually existed across much of Laurentia. At the height of the marine transgression, roughly 65% of what is now North America lay beneath the waves. The water was shallow, rarely more than a few hundred meters deep, and sunlight penetrated all the way to the bottom across vast areas. These conditions were perfect for the accumulation of carbonate sediments, the growth of reef communities, and the diversification of marine life. By the end of the Silurian, these shallow seas would begin to retreat. Sea levels dropped, exposing land that had been submerged for millions of years. In the basins left behind, evaporation concentrated the remaining seawater into briny pools that eventually precipitated thick deposits of salt and gypsum, evaporate minerals that still underlie large portions of the American Midwest, from Michigan to West Virginia. The retreat of the seas marked the transition toward a different world, one where the newly formed supercontinent of Laurussia would dominate the northern hemisphere, and the stage would be set for the next great chapter in the history of life. But that transition was still millions of years away. In the warm, flooded world of the early and middle Silurian, the conditions were ideal for one of the most spectacular developments in the history of marine ecosystems: the rise of the first truly great reef systems, living structures that would rival anything the Earth had seen before or would see again until the age of modern corals. The reefs that rose from the Silurian seafloor were like nothing the world had ever seen. For billions of years, microbial mats and stromatolites had been the only structures capable of building upward from the ocean bottom, their layered domes rarely reaching more than a meter or two in height. The Ordovician had seen the first true animal-built reefs, modest constructions of bryozoans and early corals that hinted at what was possible when organisms worked together to create three-dimensional habitats. But the extinction had leveled most of these pioneering structures, leaving behind rubble and empty space. Now, in the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, a new generation of builders was about to construct something far more ambitious: reef systems that would stretch for hundreds of kilometers along continental margins, rising tens of meters from the seafloor, creating habitats complex enough to shelter thousands of species. The master architects of this underwater construction boom were the stromatoporoids, a group of calcareous sponges that have no living descendants and whose biology remains partially mysterious even today. They grew by secreting layers of calcium carbonate, each generation building upon the calcified skeleton of the last, creating structures that accumulated slowly over thousands of years. Some grew as flat sheets encrusting the seafloor, while others formed massive domes that could reach several meters across. Still others branched upward like stone trees, their porous skeletons riddled with channels that allowed water to circulate through the living tissue. If you could have touched a living stromatoporoid, you would have felt something like wet concrete, hard and slightly rough, with tiny pores covering every surface where the sponge drew in water to filter out microscopic particles of food. The stromatoporoids did not build alone. Working alongside them, often growing directly upon their surfaces or wedged into crevices between their massive forms, were the tabulate corals. These colonial animals constructed honeycomb-like skeletons of calcium carbonate, each individual polyp living in its own small tube and contributing to the growing structure of the colony. Favosites, sometimes called the honeycomb coral for obvious reasons, was among the most common, its fossilized colonies still recognizable by the neat hexagonal pattern of their tubes. Halicites, the chain coral, grew in distinctive linked loops that look almost like someone draped strings of stone beads across the reef surface. Heliolitids added their own contribution, their colonies studded with tiny star-shaped openings where individual polyps had once extended their tentacles to capture passing food. Together, stromatoporoids and tabulate corals created something genuinely new in the history of life: wave-resistant carbonate platforms capable of withstanding the constant battering of ocean currents and storms. Earlier reefs had been fragile things, easily broken apart by strong waves or shifting sediments. The Silurian reefs were different. Their massive stromatoporoid foundations provided stability, while the corals filled in gaps and added structural complexity. Layer built upon layer, year after year, century after century, until some of these structures rose more than 100 meters above the surrounding seafloor, underwater mountains built entirely by living organisms. The reefs did not exist in isolation. They were ecosystems, complex communities where hundreds of species found food, shelter, and opportunities for reproduction. Crinoids anchored themselves to hard surfaces and extended their feathery arms into the current, filtering tiny particles from the water. Brachiopods clustered in sheltered spots, their shells gaping slightly to draw in the nutrient-rich water that flowed through the reef structure. Bryozoans encrusted every available surface, their tiny colonial animals adding their own contribution to the growing mass of calcium carbonate. Trilobites prowled the reef margins, scavenging dead organic matter and hunting smaller prey. Snails grazed on algae. Cephalopods, the ancestors of modern squid and octopus, though still confined to external shells, hunted in the open water above the reef crest. What made these communities truly remarkable was their ecological complexity. Modern coral reefs are famous for their biodiversity, their intricate webs of predator and prey, their countless specialized niches filled by organisms adapted to very specific ways of life. The Silurian reefs were approaching this level of complexity for the first time in Earth's history. Organisms were not simply living near each other. They were interacting in sophisticated ways, forming relationships that benefited both parties or exploiting each other in an endless evolutionary arms race. Some tabulate corals grew exclusively within the tissues of stromatoporoids, a symbiotic relationship whose exact nature scientists are still debating. Did the coral benefit from the stable substrate and protection offered by the sponge? Did the sponge gain something from hosting the coral? The fossils preserve the relationship, but not the reasons behind it. Recent research has revealed that some of these ancient reef builders may have shared another characteristic with modern corals: photosymbiosis. Analysis of oxygen isotopes in Silurian coral skeletons suggests that at least some species may have hosted photosynthetic algae within their tissues, just as modern reef-building corals do today. If true, this would push the origin of coral-algae symbiosis back hundreds of millions of years earlier than previously thought, and it would help explain how Silurian reefs achieved such impressive growth rates in the nutrient-poor waters of tropical continental shelves. You can still visit the remains of these ancient reef systems today, though they have been transformed almost beyond recognition by 400 million years of geological processes. The island of Gotland, off the coast of Sweden, preserves some of the finest Silurian reef exposures anywhere in the world. Walking along its rocky coastline, you are walking on the compressed and lithified remains of reef communities that thrived when this part of Baltica lay in tropical waters near the equator. The stromatoporoids have become grey limestone, their layered structure still visible if you know what to look for. The corals appear as patterns in the rock, honeycomb shapes and chain-link loops preserved in stone. In some places, you can see the original three-dimensional structure of the reef, with massive mounds rising above the surrounding rock, just as they once rose above the ancient sea floor. Similar reef deposits occur across the American Midwest, from Wisconsin to Illinois to Indiana, where Silurian limestones form prominent ridges and provide the raw material for countless quarries. The reefs that once lined the margins of tropical Laurentia now lie buried beneath cornfields and suburbs, their fossilized remains occasionally exposed in road cuts and construction sites. These ancient structures range from small patch reefs just a few tens of meters across to massive barrier complexes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the continental shelf. Some reached heights of 60 meters or more, underwater skyscrapers built one thin layer at a time by organisms no larger than your fingernail. The Silurian reefs represented a quantum leap in the complexity of marine ecosystems, but they were not the only revolution happening in those ancient seas. While stromatoporoids and corals were building their limestone empires, something far more dangerous was prowling the waters around them. Predators unlike anything the world had seen before, armored hunters that would grow to sizes that still astonish scientists today. They were not actually scorpions, despite the name that has followed them through the scientific literature for over a century. The Eurypterids belonged to a group called the Jaekelopterus, the same lineage that would eventually produce spiders, ticks, and horseshoe crabs. They breathed through gills, not lungs. They had no stinger, no venom, nothing that would qualify them as scorpions in any meaningful biological sense. But when 19th century naturalists first encountered their fossils, the segmented bodies, the grasping appendages, the long pointed tails, they reached for the most dramatic comparison available: sea scorpions. The name stuck, and perhaps that is fitting because these creatures were every bit as nightmarish as their terrestrial namesakes, and considerably larger. The Silurian was their golden age. Eurypterids had appeared in the Ordovician, modest creatures that left only scattered traces in the fossil record, but something about the post-extinction world suited them perfectly. Perhaps it was the rebuilding reef ecosystems, teeming with potential prey. Perhaps it was the absence of competitors that had kept their numbers in check. Whatever the reason, Eurypterids diversified explosively in the Silurian, filling ecological roles from bottom-dwelling scavengers to open-water apex predators. Over 250 species would eventually evolve, ranging from forms no larger than a human hand to monsters that stretched longer than a grown man is tall. The giant among giants was Jaekelopterus renaniae, an animal that holds a distinction no other arthropod has ever claimed. It was the largest of its kind to ever live. Complete specimens are rare, but a single fossilized claw discovered in Germany allowed scientists to estimate the full size of the creature that once wielded it. That claw measured 46 centimeters long, and it was missing its terminal spine. The complete appendage would have been longer still. Working backward from the proportions of related species, researchers calculated that Jaekelopterus reached lengths of 2.5 meters, roughly 8 feet from the tip of its head to the end of its tail. When it extended those massive claws forward, its total reach exceeded 3 meters, a span wide enough to embrace a small car. Try to picture this animal in life. Its body was segmented like a lobster's, covered in a tough exoskeleton that would have gleamed dark and wet in the dim waters where it hunted. The head bore a pair of large compound eyes capable of detecting movement in murky conditions, and behind them sat a smaller pair of simple eyes that may have helped gauge distance or light levels. 6 pairs of appendages extended from beneath the body, the front pair modified into those enormous pincers, the middle pairs adapted for walking or swimming, the rear pair flattened into broad paddles that propelled the creature through the water with surprising speed. The tail ended in a flattened blade that served as a rudder, allowing Jaekelopterus to steer with precision as it pursued its prey. What did it eat? Anything it could catch. The waters of the Silurian and early Devonian contained abundant fish, many of them armored with bony plates that might seem like adequate protection against predators. But the claws of Jaekelopterus were built for crushing, their inner edges lined with teeth that could grip and puncture even heavily armored prey. Fossil evidence tells a grim story. Fish with gouges in their armor that match the dimensions of Eurypterid claws, coprolites containing fragments of fish bone, trackways showing the pursuit and capture of fleeing prey. These were not ambush predators waiting patiently for food to wander within reach. They were active hunters, swimming through the water column, chasing down prey, using their superior size and weaponry to dominate every environment they entered. Jaekelopterus was the largest, but it was far from the only giant. The Pterygotidae, a family of Eurypterids that flourished in the late Silurian, produced several species that exceeded 2 meters in length. Acutiramus reached perhaps 2 meters and 10 centimeters, its elongated claws tipped with curved spines that would have made escape nearly impossible for anything caught in their grip. Pterygotus itself, the genus that gave the family its name, grew to 1 3/4 meters and ranged across both sides of the closing Iapetus Ocean, its fossils found in rocks from North America to Europe. These animals were the great white sharks of their era, apex predators that sat at the top of food webs stretching across thousands of kilometers of continental shelf. Not all Eurypterids were giants, and not all were fearsome predators. Many species remained small, filling ecological niches as scavengers, detritivores, or hunters of tiny invertebrates. Eurypterus remipes, perhaps the most commonly fossilized Eurypterid of all, rarely exceeded 30 centimeters in length, about the size of a large lobster. Its fossils are so abundant in certain Silurian deposits of New York State that it was designated the official state fossil, a reminder that these waters once teemed with armored arthropods pursuing their ancient agendas. Some Eurypterids seem to have been primarily bottom dwellers, walking across the seafloor on their multiple legs, while others were clearly adapted for swimming, their paddle-like rear appendages and streamlined bodies built for speed and maneuverability. One of the most intriguing aspects of Eurypterid biology was their relationship with land. For most of their history, Eurypterids were fully aquatic animals, as dependent on water as any fish. But some lineages developed structures that hint at an ability to venture onto shore, at least temporarily. Certain species possessed organs called chemoplaton, bookgill-like structures that may have been capable of extracting oxygen from air as well as water. Trackways preserved in Silurian sediments show Eurypterids walking across tidal flats, their pointed legs leaving distinctive impressions in mud that would eventually become stone. Whether these excursions were routine foraging trips or desperate attempts to escape predators or unfavorable conditions, we cannot say. But the image is striking. Armored giants hauling themselves out of the water and onto land, perhaps resting on wave-washed rocks, perhaps hunting the first arthropods that were beginning to colonize the shore. If you had been swimming in the coastal waters of Silurian Laurentia, you would have shared the sea with these creatures. The smaller species might have scattered at your approach, darting into crevices or burying themselves in sediment. But the giants, Jaekelopterus, Pterygotus, Acutiramus, would not have fled from anything. To them, you would have been simply another potential meal, soft-bodied and slow, lacking the armor or speed necessary to survive an encounter. The seas of the Silurian were not safe waters. They were hunting grounds, patrolled by predators whose like the world would never see again. Yet even these armored giants had to share their world with other hunters, creatures that were evolving innovations far more consequential than size or strength. In the same waters where Eurypterids reigned supreme, a quieter revolution was underway among the fish, a transformation in the structure of their bodies that would ultimately reshape the entire vertebrate lineage, including the distant ancestors of everything from sharks to songbirds to the human beings who would one day dig their fossils from the rock. Long before the Eurypterids reached their monstrous sizes, the oceans had belonged to a different kind of creature entirely. The first vertebrates were humble animals, soft-bodied and small, lacking the jaws that would later define their descendants. They had no teeth to bite with, no powerful muscles to chase down prey, no armor to protect them from the predators that shared their world. What they did have was a notochord, a flexible rod of cartilage running the length of their bodies that provided structural support and allowed for the undulating swimming motion that fish still use today. This simple innovation, appearing sometime in the Cambrian or perhaps even earlier, would prove to be one of the most consequential developments in the history of life. Every vertebrate alive today, from hagfish to hummingbirds to humans, traces its ancestry back to those ancient, jawless swimmers. By the Silurian, the descendants of those early pioneers had diversified into a bewildering variety of forms, most of them united by a single defining characteristic: armor. The ostracoderms, as scientists collectively call these armored, jawless fish, had evolved bony plates and scales that covered their heads and sometimes their entire bodies, transforming them into living tanks that traded speed and maneuverability for protection. The armor came in different configurations depending on the group. Some species wore elaborate head shields that looked almost like helmets, while others were covered in tiny overlapping scales that created a flexible but resistant coating. Whatever the specific arrangement, the message was clear. In a world full of predators, protection mattered. The thelodonts were among the most widespread of these armored swimmers, their fossils turning up in Silurian rocks from every major continent. They were covered not in large bony plates, but in thousands of tiny tooth-like scales called denticles, the same basic structure that covers the skin of modern sharks. These scales gave thelodonts a rough, sandpaper texture that would have been unpleasant for any predator attempting to swallow them whole. Most thelodonts were small, rarely exceeding 30 centimeters in length, and they seemed to have lived near the bottom of shallow seas, their flattened bodies and downward-facing mouths suggesting a lifestyle spent grubbing through sediment in search of organic particles. The osteostracans took a different approach to armor. These fish developed massive bony head shields that covered their entire front end, giving them a distinctive spade-shaped appearance that makes their fossils immediately recognizable. The head shield was not merely protective. It housed an array of sensory organs that gave osteostracans an unusually detailed picture of their environment. Lateral line canals, similar to those found in modern fish, ran across the surface of the shield and detected vibrations in the water. Some species had fields of tiny pores that may have been sensitive to electrical fields, allowing them to detect the muscle contractions of buried prey. Behind the head shield, the body was covered in overlapping scales and powered by a tail that swept back and forth in the characteristic fish fashion. In the waters of ancient China and Vietnam, a particularly strange group of jawless fish was evolving in isolation. The Galeaspids developed head shields even more elaborate than those of the osteostracans, with bizarre shapes that included horseshoe-like crescents, elongated rostrums, and lateral projections that gave some species the appearance of wearing antlers. A single, large opening on the top of the head served as both nostril and water intake, a unique arrangement found in no other vertebrate group. The Galeaspids never spread beyond their Asian homeland, their fossils confined to a relatively small region that was then part of the South China bloc. This geographic isolation makes them valuable to scientists studying how continental configurations affected the evolution and distribution of early vertebrates. The heterostracans rounded out the major groups of Silurian jawless fish, their fossils particularly abundant in the rocks of what was then Laurentia and Baltica. These fish wore armor made of distinctive bony plates that often preserved beautifully, their surfaces ornamented with ridges and tubercles that give each species a characteristic texture. Unlike the osteostracans with their complex sensory head shields, heterostracans had relatively simple armor, but they made up for it in diversity. By the late Silurian, they had radiated into dozens of species occupying habitats from shallow coastal waters to deeper offshore environments. None of these fish had jaws. This seems like such a fundamental limitation that it is worth pausing to consider how they managed to survive and thrive for tens of millions of years without the ability to bite. The answer lies in the variety of feeding strategies that jawless fish developed to exploit different food sources. Many were deposit feeders, using their circular or slit-like mouths to vacuum organic material from the seafloor like living vacuum cleaners. Others were filter feeders, drawing water through their mouths and across gill structures that trapped tiny particles of food. Some may have been parasites, attaching to larger fish and rasping away at their flesh with tongues covered in tooth-like structures, much as modern lampreys do today. The absence of jaws did not mean the absence of ecological diversity. It simply meant that diversity took different forms. If you could have watched these fish going about their daily lives in the shallow seas of Silurian Laurentia, you would have seen a world that operated by fundamentally different rules than the oceans of today. The armored ostracoderms cruising slowly above the seafloor were not the sleek, fast predators we associate with modern fish. They were grazers and scavengers, their heavy armor making them slow but well protected, their jawless mouths limiting them to food sources that did not fight back. The water column above them was patrolled by Eurypterids, and the ostracoderms' best defense against these giant predators was simply to be too difficult to eat, too bony, too awkward to swallow, not worth the effort when softer prey was available. But this world of armored grazers and jawless filter feeders was already changing. Somewhere in the Silurian seas, probably in shallow coastal environments where competition for food was intense, certain fish were undergoing a transformation that would reshape the entire vertebrate lineage. The cartilaginous arches that supported their gills were bending in new directions, moving forward, articulating in ways that allowed them to open and close. Over millions of years, these modified gill arches would become something entirely new, a hinged structure capable of grasping, biting, and chewing. The jaw was about to be born, and with it, an entirely new way of being a vertebrate. The jaw may be the single most important innovation in the history of vertebrates. This is not an exaggeration. Consider for a moment everything that jaws make possible. They allow an animal to bite, to grasp, to tear, to chew. Actions so fundamental to our experience of being alive that we rarely pause to consider what life would be like without them. Every time you eat a meal, speak a word, or smile at someone you love, you are using structures that evolved from the gill arches of ancient fish swimming in Silurian seas. The evolution of jaws did not merely add a new tool to the vertebrate toolkit. It opened up entirely new ways of making a living, new ecological roles, new evolutionary possibilities that would ultimately lead to the staggering diversity of jawed vertebrates alive today. The sharks and rays, the bony fish, the amphibians and reptiles, the birds and mammals, including the particular mammal that is listening to these words right now. The raw material for this transformation was already present in jawless fish, waiting to be repurposed. The gills of early vertebrates were supported by a series of cartilaginous arches, curved structures that held the gill slits open and provided attachment points for the muscles that pumped water across the respiratory surfaces. These gill arches were arranged in pairs, one on each side of the throat, and they were remarkably similar to one another in structure, a repeating series of skeletal elements that evolution could modify independently or in concert. At some point in the early Silurian, the first pair of these arches began to change. Instead of supporting gills, they started to bend inward and articulate with each other, forming a hinged structure that could open and close. The transition did not happen overnight. Millions of years passed as natural selection gradually reshaped these modified gill arches into something recognizably jaw-like, with upper and lower elements that met at a hinge point and could be moved by powerful muscles. The earliest jaws were probably not very impressive by modern standards, simple structures capable of grasping but not yet specialized for any particular type of feeding. But even crude jaws offered enormous advantages over the jawless condition. A fish with jaws could grab prey instead of merely sucking it up. It could bite off pieces of food too large to swallow whole. It could defend itself against predators by biting back. These advantages were so significant that jawed fish began to diversify almost immediately, spreading into ecological niches that had been inaccessible to their jawless ancestors. The fossil record of this transition is frustratingly incomplete, with long gaps between the earliest hints of jaw-like structures and the appearance of fully formed jawed fish. For decades, scientists debated exactly when and where jaws first evolved, working with fragmentary evidence that allowed for multiple interpretations. Then, in 2022, a series of papers emerged from China that transformed our understanding of early vertebrate evolution. A team led by Min Zhu announced the discovery of remarkably complete fossils from early Silurian rocks in Chongqing, specimens that preserved the detailed anatomy of fish that lived approximately 439 million years ago, just a few million years after the end Ordovician extinction. Among these fossils was Cyanodus duplicis, a small fish whose teeth represent the oldest evidence of jaws ever found. The teeth were tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, but their structure was unmistakably that of a jawed vertebrate. Other specimens from the same deposits revealed fish with combinations of features that had never been seen before, animals that seemed to blur the boundaries between groups that scientists had previously considered distinct. Eurypterids mirabilis, a fish barely 3 centimeters long, combined characteristics of placoderms, sharks, and bony fish in a mosaic that suggested the major groups of jawed vertebrates had not yet fully differentiated. The Chongqing fossils were windows into a world where the great radiation of jawed fish was just beginning, when the body plans that would dominate the oceans for the next 400 million years were still fluid and experimental. 2 major groups of jawed fish emerged from this early experimentation to dominate the Silurian seas. The placoderms were the first to develop truly robust jaws, their heads and thoraxes covered in interlocking plates of bone that gave them an armored appearance, somewhat reminiscent of the ostracoderms they were replacing. But unlike the ostracoderms, placoderms could bite. Their jaws were formed from sharpened edges of bone that worked like shearing blades, capable of slicing through flesh and crushing shells. By the late Silurian, placoderms had diversified into dozens of species, from small bottom dwellers to larger predators that prowled the reef margins. The acanthodians took a different path. These fish, sometimes misleadingly called spiny sharks, were not actually sharks at all. They appeared tens of millions of years before true sharks evolved, and their relationship to modern fish groups remains debated. What made acanthodians distinctive was the array of spines that supported their fins, bony projections that jutted out from their bodies and may have served as defensive weapons against predators. Their bodies were covered in small, square-shaped scales that fitted together like tiles, and their large eyes suggested an active, visually oriented lifestyle. Acanthodians were among the first jawed fish to venture into freshwater environments, their fossils appearing in river and lake deposits as well as marine sediments. The emergence of jawed fish fundamentally altered the dynamics of marine ecosystems. For the first time, vertebrates could be active predators rather than passive filter feeders or scavengers. They could compete directly with invertebrates like Eurypterids for prey, and over time, they would prove to be formidable competitors indeed. The great sea scorpions that had dominated the Silurian would decline through the Devonian, eventually disappearing entirely, while jawed fish would explode into thousands of species, occupying every available ecological niche. If you had been able to witness the Silurian seas, you would have been watching a changing of the guard in slow motion. The old rulers still present and powerful, but the upstarts already beginning their long ascent. The jaw revolution did more than reshape marine food webs. It set the stage for everything that would follow invertebrate evolution. The fish that would eventually crawl onto land and become the first amphibians were jawed fish. The reptiles that would dominate the Mesozoic, the mammals that would inherit the Earth after them, the birds that fill our skies today, all of them are descendants of those early jawed pioneers swimming in Silurian waters. When you open your mouth to speak or eat or breathe, you are using a modified version of the same basic structure that first appeared in fish no larger than your finger more than 400 million years ago. But the jaw was not the only revolution underway in the Silurian world. While fish were transforming the possibilities of life in the water, something equally momentous was happening in the skies above them. The atmosphere was changing, and with it, the prospects for life on land. For most of Earth's history, the land was a killing field. Not because of predators or harsh temperatures or lack of water, though all of these would pose challenges to the first terrestrial colonizers. The land was deadly because of something far more insidious, something that could not be seen or felt until the damage was already done. Ultraviolet radiation poured down from the sun in quantities that would have been lethal to any complex organism foolish enough to venture onto the exposed surface. The water offered protection. UV rays penetrate only the uppermost layers of the ocean before being absorbed. But the continents lay naked under a relentless bombardment of high-energy light that shredded DNA, destroyed proteins, and made the establishment of terrestrial life essentially impossible. The problem was oxygen, or rather the lack of it. In the modern atmosphere, oxygen molecules high in the stratosphere absorb ultraviolet radiation and transform into ozone, a molecule composed of 3 oxygen atoms instead of the usual 2. This ozone accumulates in a diffuse layer roughly 15 to 35 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and although it would fit into a band only a few millimeters thick if compressed to sea level pressure, it absorbs the vast majority of the sun's most dangerous ultraviolet wavelengths. Without the ozone layer, the surface of our planet would be sterilized by radiation. With it, life can flourish in the open air, exposed to sunlight without being destroyed by it. The ozone layer did not always exist. For the first 2 billion years of Earth's history, the atmosphere contained virtually no free oxygen. Any that was produced by early photosynthetic organisms was immediately consumed by chemical reactions with iron and other elements. Then came the Great Oxidation Event, roughly 2.4 billion years ago, when cyanobacteria finally overwhelmed the oxygen sinks, and free oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. You might expect that the ozone layer would have formed immediately afterward, finally opening the continents to colonization. But the story was not so simple. Recent research has revealed that Earth's ozone remained unstable for nearly 2 billion years after oxygen first appeared, prevented from accumulating by a surprising culprit: iodine. Iodine compounds released from the oceans rose into the atmosphere and reacted with ozone almost as fast as it could form, creating a cycle of production and destruction that kept the ozone layer from ever reaching protective levels. This iodine-ozone dynamic persisted for an almost inconceivable span of time, keeping the continents effectively off-limits to complex life even as the oceans teemed with increasingly sophisticated organisms. Only around 500 million years ago, as the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans finally shifted into a new equilibrium, did the ozone layer stabilize at levels capable of providing meaningful protection from ultraviolet radiation. The timing is striking. This stabilization occurred just as the first complex life was beginning to appear on land. The Silurian atmosphere had crossed this critical threshold. Oxygen levels had risen to perhaps 10 to 15% of their modern values, enough to generate and maintain an ozone layer that blocked the most dangerous UV wavelengths. The shield was not as robust as it is today. The continents were still bathed in higher radiation levels than modern surfaces experience, but it was sufficient. For the first time in 4 billion years of planetary history, complex organisms could survive in the open air without being cooked by invisible light. The door to the land, locked since the formation of the Earth, had finally cracked open. This may seem like a technical detail, a piece of atmospheric chemistry with little relevance to the grand narrative of life's evolution. But consider what it meant in practical terms. Before the ozone layer stabilized, any organism that ventured above the waterline faced immediate and cumulative damage to its cellular machinery. Algal mats might survive in the splash zone, protected by pigments and rapid cell division, but nothing more complex could establish itself. After the ozone layer stabilized, suddenly the rules changed. The same sun that had been a lethal threat became merely a challenge to be managed, a source of energy for photosynthesis, rather than a constant assault on biological integrity. The organisms that would eventually take advantage of this new opportunity were already present in the Silurian seas, living in tidal zones and estuaries where they experienced regular exposure to air. Algae and cyanobacteria had long colonized the edges of the water, forming mats and films on rocks that were periodically exposed by low tides. Some had developed pigments that provided additional protection against UV radiation, orange and red compounds that absorbed dangerous wavelengths before they could reach sensitive cellular structures. Others had evolved rapid DNA repair mechanisms that could fix radiation damage almost as fast as it occurred. These adaptations, developed over hundreds of millions of years of life at the water's edge, would prove essential for the colonization that was about to begin. If you had visited the coastline of Silurian Laurentia, you would have seen a world poised on the edge of transformation. The tidal flats would have been streaked with colors, greens and browns and rusty oranges where microbial communities clung to the damp rock. In sheltered estuaries, the water's edge would have blurred into a zone that was neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial. A transitional environment where organisms experienced the best and worst of both worlds. The sun overhead would have felt much as it does today, warm on your skin, bright in your eyes, with no visible sign of the invisible shield that now made its warmth survivable. The stage was set, the ozone layer had stabilized. The transitional environments were full of organisms pre-adapted for aerial exposure, and the empty continents stretched inland like blank pages waiting to be written upon. What happened next would begin as a tentative experiment in a few coastal wetlands, but it would ultimately transform the face of the Earth more profoundly than any previous event in the history of life. The first true plants were about to set root in soil, and the greening of the world was about to begin. The first forests did not exist, the first meadows did not exist, the first blades of grass, the first flowers, the first leaves broad enough to cast a shadow, none of these had yet appeared on Earth. When plants first colonized the land in the Silurian, they were barely recognizable as plants at all. They had no roots to anchor them in soil, no leaves to capture sunlight, no seeds to disperse their offspring across the landscape. What they had was something far more fundamental: vascular tissue, a system of internal tubes capable of transporting water from one part of the organism to another. This single innovation, modest as it sounds, would prove to be the key that unlocked the continents. Without vascular tissue, plants were confined to environments where every cell could absorb water directly from the surroundings, moist rocks, the edges of streams, places where the air itself was saturated with humidity. With vascular tissue, they could lift water from the ground and carry it upward, allowing them to grow taller, spread wider, and eventually colonize habitats far from any standing water. The earliest of these vascular pioneers was Cooksonia, a plant so small and simple that you might walk past a living specimen without ever noticing it. The largest known fossils stand perhaps 6 centimeters tall, roughly the height of your thumb, and most specimens were considerably smaller. The entire plant consisted of a branching stem that divided into Y-shaped forks, each branch ending in a tiny bulbous structure called a sporangium, where reproductive spores were produced. There were no leaves, no flowers, no roots in any modern sense, just those slender green stems rising from the damp ground, splitting and splitting again until they terminated in their spore-bearing tips. Cooksonia was named in honour of Isabel Cookson, an Australian paleobotanist who spent decades studying the earliest land plants, and it was first formally described in 1937 from fossils found in Wales and Scotland. Since then, specimens have turned up in Silurian rocks from every major continent, testimony to how quickly these simple plants spread once they gained their foothold on land. The oldest confirmed Cooksonia fossils come from the Czech Republic and date to roughly 425 to 427 million years ago, placing them firmly in the Wenlock epoch of the Middle Silurian. But isolated spores and fragmentary stems suggest that vascular plants may have been experimenting with terrestrial life even earlier, perhaps as far back as the Ordovician, though the evidence remains contested. If you could have knelt beside a living Cooksonia plant, examining it closely in the pale light of a Silurian afternoon, you would have noticed something crucial about its anatomy. Running up the center of each stem was a dark strand of tissue, visible as a thin line when the stem was cut in cross-section. This was the vascular bundle, the plant's internal plumbing system, composed of specialized cells called tracheids that had evolved the ability to transport water against the pull of gravity. The walls of these cells were reinforced with lignin, a tough organic polymer that provided structural support and prevented the cells from collapsing under the negative pressure created by water being pulled upward. Lignin would eventually become one of the most abundant organic compounds on Earth, forming the woody tissue of trees and accumulating in vast deposits that would one day become coal. Cooksonia also possessed stomata, microscopic pores on the surface of its stems that could open and close to regulate the exchange of gases with the atmosphere. When the stomata opened, carbon dioxide could enter for photosynthesis and oxygen could escape as a waste product. When they closed, the plant could conserve water, reducing the evaporation that was the unavoidable cost of living in open air. The evolution of stomata solved one of the fundamental challenges of terrestrial life: how to obtain carbon dioxide from the atmosphere without desiccating in the process. Every plant you have ever seen, from the grass beneath your feet to the tallest redwood, uses essentially the same solution that Cooksonia pioneered more than 400 million years ago. The world that Cooksonia inhabited was not entirely barren. Microbial mats and crusts had long colonized the edges of water bodies, forming thin films of photosynthetic organisms that stabilized sediments and added organic matter to the developing soils. Mosses and liverworts, or organisms very much like them, may have been present as well, though their fossil record from this period is sparse because they lacked the hard tissues that preserve well in rock. What made Cooksonia different was its ability to grow upward, to rise above the competition for light and disperse its spores on the wind rather than relying on water for reproduction. These advantages seem modest, but they were enough to establish vascular plants as the dominant form of terrestrial vegetation within a few tens of millions of years. Cooksonia was probably not a single species, but rather a grade of organization, a level of complexity that multiple lineages achieved independently as they adapted to life on land. Some Cooksonia-like plants were likely ancestors of the lycophytes, the group that includes modern club mosses. Others may have given rise to different lineages entirely, their descendants evolving in directions that would only become clear in the Devonian and later periods. The fossils we find represent experiments in terrestrial life, some successful and some ultimately doomed, all of them feeling their way into a world that no plant had ever occupied before. In Australia, paleontologists have found fossils of Baragwanathea, a plant considerably more complex than Cooksonia that appears in rocks of similar or even slightly older age. Baragwanathia had true leaves, small scale-like structures that spiraled around its stems, and it could grow to heights of perhaps 25 centimeters, towering over its simpler contemporaries. Its presence in the Silurian fossil record has puzzled scientists for decades because it seems too advanced for its time, as if a smartphone had turned up in a museum exhibit about the telegraph. Some researchers have questioned the dating of the rocks that contain Baragwanathia, suggesting they may be younger than originally thought. Others argue that plant evolution in the Silurian was simply faster and more experimental than we have traditionally assumed, with multiple lineages racing toward complexity along parallel tracks. Whatever the precise timeline, the Silurian saw the establishment of vascular plants as permanent residents of the terrestrial environment. They remained confined to moist habitats near water, their lack of true roots limiting how far they could spread from streams and wetlands. They were small, simple, and easily overlooked, but they had crossed a threshold that would never be uncrossed. The land, barren for 4 billion years, was turning green at its edges, and where plants led, animals would inevitably follow. The plants had been first, but they would not be alone for long. Within a few million years of the earliest vascular plants establishing themselves in coastal wetlands, something else began to move across the damp margins between sea and land. They came on many legs, 6, 8, dozens, hundreds, and they brought with them a revolution in animal physiology that would prove just as consequential as anything the plants had achieved. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, animals were breathing air directly, pulling oxygen from the atmosphere through specialized organs that had no precedent in the aquatic world. The arthropods had arrived on land, and they would never leave. The transition from water to air presented challenges that plants had not faced. An animal cannot simply sit in one place and absorb what it needs from the environment. It must move, find food, avoid predators, locate mates, all activities that require energy, which requires oxygen, which requires a way of extracting that oxygen from whatever medium surrounds the organism. In water, gills do this job admirably, their thin membranes allowing dissolved oxygen to diffuse directly into the blood. But gills collapse in air, their delicate filaments sticking together without water to support them. And even if they could maintain their structure, the concentration of oxygen in air is so much higher than in water that different mechanisms are needed to handle it efficiently. The solution that arthropods evolved was the tracheal system, a network of internal tubes that carry air directly from openings on the body surface to the tissues that need it. These openings, called spiracles, can be seen on the sides of insects and many other terrestrial arthropods today. Small holes that lead into branching passages, progressively narrower until they reach individual cells. Oxygen diffuses down these tubes without any need for blood to carry it. A simple and elegant solution that works beautifully at small body sizes. The evolution of spiracles and tracheal tubes was the key that allowed arthropods to become truly terrestrial, freeing them from the need to return to water for respiration. The oldest evidence of this air-breathing apparatus comes from a creature found in Silurian rocks near Stonehaven on the northeastern coast of Scotland. Pneumodesmus pneumoni was a millipede, or something very close to one, and it lived approximately 430 million years ago during the late Wenlock or early Ludlow epoch. The fossil itself is tiny, a fragment of cuticle barely a centimeter long, but preserved on its surface are unmistakable spiracles, the breathing holes that mark it as an air-breathing animal. This small piece of exoskeleton represents the oldest direct evidence of terrestrial respiration ever found, proof that arthropods had solved the problem of breathing air by the middle of the Silurian period. Pneumodesmus was a detritivore, an animal that fed on dead and decaying organic matter rather than hunting live prey. This makes ecological sense for an early land colonizer. The first terrestrial ecosystems would have been simple affairs, lacking the complex food webs that characterize modern environments. Dead plant material, bacterial mats, fungal growths, algal crusts. These would have been the primary food sources available to the earliest land animals, and millipedes were ideally suited to exploit them. Their many legs allowed them to navigate uneven terrain. Their tough exoskeletons protected them from desiccation, and their digestive systems could process the tough, cellulose-rich tissues of early land plants. They were recyclers, breaking down organic matter and returning nutrients to the thin soils that were just beginning to form. But millipedes were not the only arthropods making the transition to land. The fossil record of the late Silurian, particularly from a site called Ludford Lane in Shropshire, England, reveals that terrestrial ecosystems had already achieved a surprising level of complexity by around 414 million years ago. At Ludford Lane, paleontologists have found not only detritivores but predators, at least 2 species of centipede and a trigonotarbid arachnid, an extinct relative of spiders. The presence of predators implies the presence of prey, which implies a functioning food web with multiple trophic levels. These were not isolated pioneers struggling to survive in an alien environment. They were members of established communities, ecosystems that had been developing for millions of years before the Ludford Lane sediments preserved a snapshot of their existence. The centipedes at Ludford Lane were hunters, their flattened bodies and numerous legs adapted for pursuing prey through the leaf litter and soil crevices of early terrestrial habitats. Unlike millipedes, which have 2 pairs of legs per body segment and move in slow, undulating waves, centipedes have 1 pair per segment and can move with startling speed when pursuing prey or escaping danger. Their front legs had been modified into venomous fangs called forcipules, capable of injecting toxins that paralyzed smaller arthropods. The presence of these specialized predators in the Silurian tells us that the colonization of land was not a tentative, half-hearted affair. It was a full-scale invasion, with organisms already evolving the specialized equipment needed to hunt and kill in the new terrestrial environment. The trigonotarbid arachnids were equally formidable predators, though they hunted in a different style. Related to modern spiders but belonging to an entirely separate lineage, trigonotarbids had 8 legs and segmented abdomens covered in plates of hardened cuticle. They could not spin silk. That innovation would come later, in true spiders, but they were ambush predators nonetheless, waiting in concealment for smaller arthropods to wander within reach of their grasping pedipalps. If you could have walked through the coastal wetlands of late Silurian Laurentia, watching where you placed your feet among the Cooksonia stems and liverwort mats, you might have caught a glimpse of these ancient hunters frozen in momentary stillness, waiting for their next meal to stumble past. Early scorpions were also present during the Silurian, though their relationship with land was more ambiguous. Many Silurian scorpions retained book gills rather than book lungs, suggesting they were still primarily aquatic, or at least dependent on very moist environments. They may have been transitional forms, capable of brief excursions onto land, but not yet fully committed to terrestrial life. The fossils show them in both marine and freshwater deposits, and some specimens have been found in sediments that suggest tidal flat environments, places where they might have experienced regular exposure to air. Over time, some lineages would complete the transition and become fully terrestrial, their book gills evolving into the book lungs that allow modern scorpions to thrive in some of the driest environments on Earth. By the end of the Silurian, the outlines of terrestrial ecosystems were becoming clear. Primary producers, the simple vascular plants and the microbial mats that preceded them, formed the base of the food web. Detritivores like millipedes processed dead organic matter, recycling nutrients and contributing to soil formation. Predators like centipedes and trigonotarbids hunted the detritivores and each other, adding another layer of complexity to the system. It was still a far cry from the rich terrestrial ecosystems that would develop in the Devonian and later periods, but the foundation had been laid. Life had established a permanent presence on land, and it would never retreat to the sea. The arthropods had proven that the continents were habitable, but they were working with a world still in transition. The plants that sustained the earliest land ecosystems were small and confined to wet environments. The soils were thin and poor. The ecological niches available to terrestrial organisms were limited compared to what the oceans offered. Yet even as these first colonizers were establishing their beachhead, the planet itself was changing in ways that would reshape the possibilities for life on land. Continents were colliding, mountains were rising, and the geography of the Earth was being rewritten on a scale that would alter climates, ocean currents, and the very distribution of habitable environments across the globe. The Earth never stops moving. We tend to think of the ground beneath our feet as solid and permanent, the one thing in a changing world that can be relied upon to stay put. But the continents are not fixed in place. They ride on plates of lithosphere that float on the partially molten mantle below, driven by convection currents that push and pull them across the surface of the planet at rates of a few centimeters per year. A few centimeters per year sounds trivial, barely worth measuring. But over millions of years, those centimeters accumulate into thousands of kilometers. Oceans open and close. Continents collide and break apart. Mountain ranges rise and wear away. The geography of the Earth is constantly being rewritten, and the Silurian was a period when one of the most dramatic chapters in that rewriting was reaching its climax. The collision had been building for tens of millions of years before the Silurian began. Laurentia, the ancient continent that would become North America, sat near the equator, its eastern margin facing an ocean called the Iapetus that had been widening since the late Precambrian. On the other side of that ocean, Baltica, the landmass that would become Scandinavia and Northern Europe, was rotating and drifting westward, drawn by the same tectonic forces that would eventually bring it into contact with its neighbor. Between them, caught in the narrowing gap, was Avalonia, a slender microcontinent carrying the rocks that would one day form England, Wales, and parts of eastern North America. The Iapetus Ocean was closing at a rate that would have been imperceptible to any observer standing on its shores. Perhaps 2 or 3 centimeters per year, the width of a human thumb, vanishing beneath the advancing plates as oceanic crust dove down into the mantle at subduction zones along the continental margins. But that steady consumption of ocean floor meant that the continents on either side were drawing inexorably closer, and by the middle of the Silurian they were close enough for the collision to begin in earnest. When continents collide, something has to give. Oceanic crust, dense and thin, can be pushed down into the mantle and recycled, but continental crust is too buoyant to subduct. Instead, it crumples. The rocks along the margins of the colliding continents are compressed, folded, thrust over one another in great sheets, heated and metamorphosed by the tremendous pressures involved. The crust thickens as material piles up, and the thickened crust rises isostatically, floating higher on the mantle, like a heavily loaded ship rides lower in the water than an empty one. Mountains grow, pushed up by forces that can lift rock faster than erosion can wear it down, at least for a time. The mountains that rose from the Laurentia-Baltica collision are called the Caledonides, named after Caledonia, the Latin name for Scotland. At their peak, they may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height, though we cannot know this for certain because 400 million years of erosion have worn them down to stumps. What remains today are the Scottish Highlands, the mountains of western Norway, the hills of Wales and Ireland, and the northern reaches of the Appalachians, all fragments of a single great mountain chain that once stretched across the supercontinent that was forming from the collision. When you stand on a Scottish hillside and look out across the heather-covered slopes, you are looking at the eroded roots of mountains that once scraped the sky. The collision brought together rocks that had been separated for hundreds of millions of years, rocks that had formed on opposite sides of an ocean and accumulated completely different fossils during their long separation. This is how geologists first realized that the Iapetus Ocean had existed, by finding marine fossils in Scotland that matched fossils from North America but were completely different from fossils found in England, just a few hundred kilometers to the south. Scotland and England had been on opposite sides of the ocean, their fossil assemblages as distinct as the faunas of the Atlantic and Pacific are today. The suture where they joined, a zone of intensely deformed rocks marking the line where two continents became one, runs roughly along the modern border between Scotland and England, though the precise trace is complicated by later geological events. The formation of this suture meant that by the late Silurian, Laurentia, Baltica and Avalonia had merged into a single landmass that geologists call Laurussia, or sometimes Euramerica, or the Old Red Continent. This new supercontinent stretched from the tropics into the northern temperate zones, its interior dominated by the eroding Caledonian Mountains and the rivers that carried their sediments down to coastal plains and deltas. The red color that gives the Old Red Continent its name comes from the oxidized iron in these sediments, a sign that they were deposited in terrestrial environments where oxygen was abundant, a stark contrast to the black, organic-rich shales that accumulated in oxygen-poor marine settings. The assembly of Laurussia was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Gondwana still sprawled across the southern hemisphere, and other continental fragments, Siberia, the China blocks, smaller terrains whose names are known only to specialists, drifted in isolation across the world ocean. But the collision that formed Laurussia set a pattern that would continue for hundreds of millions of years as the scattered continents slowly converged toward the supercontinent Pangaea that would dominate the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic. The Silurian was a way station on that journey, a moment when the map was being redrawn but had not yet reached its final configuration. If you could have stood on the shores of the newly formed Laurussia, looking inland toward the young Caledonian Mountains, you would have witnessed a landscape in the process of transformation. Rivers swollen with sediment poured down from the highlands, depositing layers of sand and gravel that would eventually become the Old Red Sandstone, a rock formation that stretches from Britain to Greenland to eastern North America. The coastal plains were spreading, creating new habitats for the plants and arthropods that had begun colonizing the land. And in the shallow seas that still covered much of the continental interior, life continued its endless experimentation, oblivious to the tectonic forces that were reshaping the world above the waterline. The mountains would not last. Nothing built by geology lasts forever, not even ranges as mighty as the Caledonides. Erosion began wearing them down almost as soon as they rose, carrying their substance grain by grain to the sea, depositing it in deltas and coastal plains and submarine fans. Within 100 million years, the Great Peaks would be reduced to rolling hills, and within another 100 million years, even those hills would be worn nearly flat. But the legacy of the collision would persist long after the mountains themselves had vanished. The supercontinent it helped create would shape the course of evolution for hundreds of millions of years, and the rocks it deformed and metamorphosed would preserve a record of its violence that geologists can still read today. While continents collided and mountains rose, life in the Silurian seas continued on its own trajectory, shaped by forces both global and local. The changing geography altered ocean currents and climate patterns, creating new environments and eliminating old ones. Species that had thrived in the conditions of the early Silurian found themselves struggling as their habitats shifted or disappeared, while others flourished in the new ecological spaces that opened up. The marine world was changing, and the next chapter in the story of Silurian life would be written by the creatures that adapted to those changes. The Silurian seas were crowded with survivors, every creature swimming, crawling, or drifting through those ancient waters carried within it a legacy of catastrophe, a genetic inheritance shaped by the mass extinction that had ended the Ordovician. The species that dominated the Silurian marine world were not simply the same organisms that had existed before the extinction, continuing their lives as if nothing had happened. They were the descendants of the lucky few, the lineages that had made it through the bottleneck while their competitors perished. And that experience of survival had reshaped them in ways both obvious and subtle, creating communities that functioned differently than the ones that had come before. The brachiopods illustrate this transformation as clearly as any group. Before the extinction, brachiopod communities had been remarkably diverse and highly endemic, with different species adapted to different regions and different conditions across the globe. The extinction erased much of this diversity, eliminating entire families and leaving only a handful of surviving lineages to repopulate the empty sea floors. But those survivors proved remarkably adaptable. The pentamerids, a group characterized by their thick shells and distinctive internal supports, underwent an explosive radiation in the early Silurian, their descendants spreading across continental shelves on every major landmass. Within a few million years, you could find pentamerids in the warm shallows of Laurentia, the coastal waters of Baltica, and the margins of Gondwana, the same basic body plan succeeding in environments that had previously hosted completely different brachiopod assemblages. There was something else unusual about these post-extinction pentamerids. They were smaller than their Ordovician ancestors, noticeably and consistently smaller, as if evolution had decided that compact was better than grand. This pattern, the Lilliput effect, appears repeatedly in the fossil record after mass extinctions, though scientists still debate exactly why it occurs. Perhaps smaller organisms can survive on fewer resources during times of scarcity. Perhaps they can reproduce faster, allowing populations to recover more quickly when conditions improve. Perhaps the ecological disruption following extinction simply removes the competitive pressures that normally favor larger body sizes. Whatever the cause, the Silurian brachiopods were modest creatures compared to their forebears, building their shells with an economy of material that would have seemed almost miserly to an Ordovician observer. The corals and stromatoporoids that built the great Silurian reefs were also products of post-extinction recovery, their success made possible by the elimination of competitors that had previously kept their numbers in check. Tabulate corals had existed in the Ordovician, but they had been minor components of reef ecosystems overshadowed by other groups that monopolized the best habitats and the most favorable conditions. The extinction changed the balance of power. With their competitors gone, tabulate corals expanded into niches they had never occupied before, forming partnerships with stromatoporoid sponges that would dominate reef construction for the next 100 million years. The reefs they built were not simply reconstructions of what had existed before. They were new structures, new communities, new ways of organizing marine ecosystems that emerged from the wreckage of the old. The crinoids tell a similar story of survival and success. These graceful echinoderms, with their flower-like arms and long stalks anchoring them to the seafloor, had weathered the extinction better than most marine invertebrates. Roughly 70% of crinoid genera made it through to the Silurian, a survival rate that would be the envy of most other groups. Released from competition with the lineages that had perished, crinoids spread across the continental shelves of the recovering world, forming dense meadows on the seafloor that filtered particles from the water and provided habitat for countless smaller organisms. In some Silurian deposits, crinoid fossils are so abundant that they form the primary component of the rock, their disc-shaped stem segments piled atop one another in layers meters thick. Not all groups fared so well. The trilobites, those iconic arthropods that had dominated Paleozoic seafloors since the Cambrian, never truly recovered from the Ordovician-Silurian extinction. They had been hit hard, losing entire families and major evolutionary lineages in the space of a few million years. The survivors diversified to some extent in the Silurian, filling niches left empty by their departed relatives, but they never regained the diversity or ecological dominance they had enjoyed in earlier periods. If you had counted trilobite species in the Ordovician and then counted them again in the Silurian, you would have noticed the decline immediately. Fewer forms, fewer body plans, fewer ways of being a trilobite. They were still present, still locally abundant in many environments, but they were a dynasty in retreat, holding the remnants of an empire that had been crumbling since the end of the Cambrian. Calamine was perhaps the most successful of the Silurian trilobites, its fossils so common in certain rock formations that it would eventually be designated the state fossil of Wisconsin. This small trilobite, rarely exceeding 10 centimeters in length, had a distinctive ability to roll itself into a tight ball when threatened, tucking its vulnerable underside away from predators behind a shield of hardened exoskeleton. The rocks of the American Midwest preserve countless specimens of calamine, frozen in death in positions ranging from fully extended to tightly enrolled, testimony to lives lived in constant awareness of the dangers that surrounded them. When you hold a calamine fossil in your hand, you are holding the remains of an animal that swam in seas covering what is now Illinois and Wisconsin, seas that were warm and shallow and full of predators waiting for a careless trilobite to let down its guard. The graptolites continued their long decline through the Silurian, though they remained essential tools for scientists trying to date the rocks in which they are found. These colonial organisms, whose saw-blade fossils are so common in Silurian shales, had been far more diverse in the Ordovician when they filled the planktonic realm in forms ranging from simple single-branched structures to elaborate spiraling colonies. The extinction had pruned this diversity dramatically, leaving only a few lineages to carry on into the Silurian. Each epoch of the Silurian is marked by characteristic graptolite species: Parachidographtus acuminatus in the earliest Landovery, Ceatographtus centrifugus in the Wenlock, Monograptus perultimus near the end. Their changing forms providing a timeline that geologists use to correlate rocks from different parts of the world. Among the mollusks and other marine invertebrates, similar patterns of decline and recovery played out according to each group's particular circumstances. Gastropods and bivalves persisted through the extinction and diversified in the Silurian, though they would not achieve their modern dominance for hundreds of millions of years. Nautiloid cephalopods, the coiled and straight-shelled relatives of modern nautilus, continued to prowl the Silurian seas as active predators, their tentacles grasping prey and their jet propulsion carrying them through the water column. Bryozoans recovered from the extinction, but with a different cast of characters, some Ordovician groups disappearing entirely while others radiated into the empty niches. The overall picture is one of communities in flux, ecosystems still sorting themselves out after a catastrophe that had reshuffled the deck of marine life. This sorting process was not random. The species that thrived in the Silurian were those best suited to the particular conditions of the post-extinction world. The generalists that could exploit a wide range of resources, the opportunists that could reproduce quickly and colonize empty habitats, the survivors whose traits happened to match the new selective pressures they faced. Evolution does not plan ahead, does not anticipate which characteristics will prove useful in future catastrophes. It simply favors whatever works in the present. and the presence of the Silurian favoured organisms quite different from those that had dominated the Ordovician. The changing guard of Silurian marine life was part of a larger pattern that would repeat itself after every mass extinction in Earth's history. The survivors inherit a world impoverished but full of opportunity, and they diversify to fill the empty spaces, often in ways that would have been impossible before the catastrophe removed their competitors. The Silurian seas were a laboratory of evolutionary experimentation, a place where the blueprints for future marine ecosystems were being drafted even as the ink on the old blueprints was still drying. And deep within those seas, in sediments accumulating on the floors of shallow basins and along the margins of continents, something else was being created. Something that would not reveal its importance for hundreds of millions of years, when human beings would drill into ancient rocks searching for the energy that powers modern civilization. Deep beneath the sea floor, in the darkness where no light had ever penetrated, the dead were piling up. This is not a poetic exaggeration. In certain basins along the margins of Gondwana and in the deeper waters of closing oceans, organic matter was accumulating in quantities that defied easy comprehension. The bodies of countless planktonic organisms, graptolites, algae, bacteria, the countless microscopic creatures that formed the base of Silurian food webs, drifted down through the water column and settled on the bottom, layer upon layer, year after year, millennium after millennium. Under normal circumstances, this organic rain would have been consumed by scavengers and decomposers, recycled back into the nutrient cycles of the living ocean. But these were not normal circumstances. The bottom waters of these basins were anoxic, devoid of the oxygen that most life requires, and in that suffocating darkness, the dead remained undisturbed. The result was the formation of black shales, rocks so dark they seem to absorb light, their colour a testament to the organic carbon locked within them. When you see black shale in an outcrop or a museum specimen, you are looking at compressed death, millions of years of biological productivity squeezed into layers of stone. The organic matter that gives these rocks their distinctive appearance has been transformed by heat and pressure over hundreds of millions of years, its complex biological molecules broken down and reassembled into simpler compounds. Some of those compounds are familiar to anyone who has ever filled a gas tank or heated a home with natural gas. The black shales of the Silurian are source rocks, the geological formations where petroleum and natural gas were first generated before migrating into the reservoir rocks where we find them today. The most extensive Silurian black shales were deposited along the northern margin of Gondwana, in a belt that stretched from what is now North Africa through the Middle East and into the Arabian Peninsula. During the early Silurian, this region lay along the southern edge of a shrinking ocean, where restricted circulation and high biological productivity combined to create conditions perfect for organic preservation. The water was deep enough that sunlight could not reach the bottom, preventing photosynthesis from adding oxygen to the lower layers. The basin was partially enclosed, limiting the inflow of oxygenated water from the open ocean. And the surface waters were fertile, fed by nutrients that upwelled from the depths and supported vast blooms of photosynthetic plankton. The graptolites were particularly important contributors to these organic-rich deposits. Their colonial bodies, built from proteins and other organic compounds, sank to the bottom in enormous numbers when individual colonies died. The distinctive saw-blade fossils that make graptolites so useful for dating Silurian rocks are found most commonly in black shales, their remains preserved in exquisite detail because the anoxic conditions prevented decay. In some formations, graptolite fossils are so abundant that they form the primary component of the rock, dark smears against a dark background, testament to the countless trillions of colonial animals that lived and died in the waters above. Today, these ancient deposits underlie some of the most economically important petroleum provinces on Earth. The Silurian black shales of North Africa, the so-called hot shales, named for their high organic content, are the source of 80 to 90% of all Paleozoic hydrocarbons in the region. The oil and gas fields of Libya, Algeria, and Egypt draw their wealth from organic matter that accumulated on the seafloor more than 400 million years ago, when graptolites drifted in waters that no longer exist above lands that had not yet taken their modern shapes. Similar deposits occur in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, where Silurian source rocks contribute to petroleum systems that have shaped global economics and geopolitics in ways the creatures that formed them could never have imagined. The formation of petroleum from organic-rich sediments is a process that unfolds over geological timescales, requiring specific conditions of temperature, pressure, and burial depth. When the Silurian black shales were first deposited, they were simply mud, dark, organic-rich mud, but mud nonetheless. Over millions of years, as additional sediments accumulated above them, they were buried deeper and deeper, compressed by the weight of overlying rock and heated by the Earth's internal warmth. At temperatures between roughly 60 and 120 degrees Celsius, the organic matter within the shales began to transform. Complex biological molecules broke down into simpler hydrocarbons, the long chains and ring structures of petroleum compounds forming from the remains of organisms that had died hundreds of millions of years earlier. This transformation is called catagenesis, and it is the critical step that converts organic-rich rock into a petroleum source. Not all of the organic matter in a black shale becomes oil or gas. Much of it remains locked in the rock as kerogen, a waxy organic substance that requires even higher temperatures to break down completely. But enough hydrocarbons are generated during catagenesis to create commercial quantities of petroleum, provided the geology cooperates in other ways. The oil and gas must migrate from the source rock into porous reservoir rocks where they can accumulate in extractable concentrations. They must be trapped by impermeable layers that prevent them from escaping to the surface, and they must survive for hundreds of millions of years without being destroyed by further heating, erosion, or other geological processes. If you have ever driven a car, flown in an airplane, or heated your home with natural gas, there is a reasonable chance that some of the energy you used originated in the Silurian seas. The organic matter that accumulated in those ancient anoxic basins has traveled a long journey to reach your fuel tank. From living organisms to accumulated sediment, from sediment to rock, from rock to source bed, from source bed through migration pathways to reservoir, and finally from reservoir through wells and pipelines to the moment of combustion that released the energy stored in those ancient chemical bonds. 400 million years of Earth history connect the graptolites of the Silurian to the morning commute of a 21st century human being. There is something almost unsettling about this connection, a reminder that our modern civilization depends on the compressed remains of life forms so ancient that they predate the existence of fish with jaws, of plants with leaves, of animals that could breathe air. The petroleum economy is built on a foundation of deep time, drawing on reserves that took hundreds of millions of years to create and that we are consuming in a matter of centuries. Whether this is wise, whether it is sustainable, whether we should be searching for alternatives, these are questions that the Silurian graptolites cannot answer for us. They can only offer their remains, transformed by time and pressure into the fuel that powers the world we have built. But the black shales are only one part of the Silurians' legacy, one window into a world that has left its traces scattered across the modern Earth. In other rocks from this ancient period, different kinds of windows preserve different kinds of stories, snapshots of ecosystems frozen in stone, moments of time captured with a clarity that allows us to reconstruct the living world in remarkable detail. The fossil record is not a complete archive of ancient life. This is one of the first lessons that paleontology teaches, and one of the most important. The vast majority of organisms that have ever lived left no trace of their existence, their soft bodies consumed by scavengers and decomposers, their delicate structures dissolved by the chemistry of sediments, their very atoms recycled into new generations of living things. To become a fossil requires a specific set of circumstances: rapid burial, the right chemical conditions, hard parts capable of mineralization, and then millions of years of luck as the encasing rock survives erosion, metamorphism, and all the other geological processes that destroy more evidence than they preserve. What we have in museum collections and research institutions is not a representative sample of past life, but a highly biased selection, skewed toward organisms with shells and bones, toward environments where burial was rapid and preservation favorable. And yet, scattered across the world, there are places where the circumstances aligned just right, where the windows into the past are clearer than we have any right to expect. The Silurian has more than its share of these exceptional sites, localities where the quality of preservation allows us to reconstruct ancient ecosystems with a precision that borders on the miraculous. To visit these places, or even to study the fossils they have yielded, is to come as close as we ever can to walking through a world that vanished 400 million years ago. Gotland is perhaps the most famous of these Silurian windows. This Swedish island, sitting in the Baltic Sea between the coasts of Sweden and Latvia, is built almost entirely from Silurian limestone, the accumulated remains of reef communities that thrived when this region lay in tropical waters near the equator. Walk along the rocky shores of Gotland and you are walking on the compressed skeletons of stromatoporoids and corals, the calcified foundations of ecosystems that flourished here for millions of years before continental drift carried them northward into colder latitudes. The cliffs expose layer after layer of reef development, allowing researchers to trace the evolution of these communities through time, watching as different species rose to dominance and then gave way to their successors. What makes Gotland particularly valuable to scientists is the range of environments it preserves. The Lower Visby beds record a mesophotic reef ecosystem, a community that lived at depths of around 100 meters, where light was dim and conditions quite different from the sun-drenched shallows most people imagine when they think of coral reefs. The Höklint Formation preserves shallower reef communities, places where sunlight penetrated to the bottom and photosynthetic organisms could thrive. And in younger rocks, scientists have identified what may be the oldest turbid reef ecosystem ever discovered, a community that lived in murky waters where sediment clouded the water column and only organisms adapted to low-light conditions could survive. This diversity of preserved environments gives us a three-dimensional picture of Silurian marine life, showing how different communities occupied different ecological niches across the continental shelf. The American Midwest preserves a different kind of Silurian window. From Wisconsin through Illinois and Indiana, Silurian reef deposits form prominent ridges in the landscape, their resistant limestone standing above the surrounding terrain like the fossilized backbones of ancient sea monsters. These reefs were first described by geologists in the 19th century, making them among the earliest recognized ancient reef systems in North America. Some are modest patch reefs just a few tens of meters across, while others are massive structures that stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the margins of the shallow sea that once covered the continental interior. The quarries that have been cut into these formations expose their internal structure in remarkable detail, revealing the growth patterns of stromatoporoids, the distribution of coral colonies, and the countless smaller organisms that filled every available niche within the reef community. In England, the rocks around Ludlow in Shropshire have given their name to an entire epoch of the Silurian. The Ludlow series preserves a transition from marine to increasingly terrestrial conditions, with fossils ranging from typical marine invertebrates to some of the earliest evidence of life on land. It was here, at the site called Ludford Lane, that paleontologists discovered the arthropod assemblage that proved complex terrestrial ecosystems existed by the late Silurian, the centipedes and trigonotarbid arachnids that we encountered earlier in our journey. The Ludlow rocks are a reminder that the Silurian was not merely a time of marine diversification, but also the period when the colonization of land was gaining momentum, when the barren continents were beginning their long transformation into the green and living landscapes we know today. Scotland preserves yet another piece of the Silurian puzzle. The rocks near Stonehaven on the northeastern coast have yielded Pneumodesmus neumani, that tiny millipede fragment whose spiracles represent the oldest direct evidence of air breathing in any animal. The Scottish Silurian also preserves evidence of the strange world that existed before Laurentia and Avalonia collided, when the rocks now found in Scotland were separated from the rocks of England by an ocean hundreds of kilometres wide. The fossils found in Scottish Silurian formations match those from North America, not those from England, a pattern that only makes sense when you understand that Scotland and England were on opposite sides of the Iapetus Ocean until the late Silurian brought them together. The most revolutionary Silurian fossils of recent years have come from China, from deposits in Chongqing and surrounding regions that have transformed our understanding of early vertebrate evolution. The fish fossils discovered here, Chianodus with its teeth, Eurypterids with its mosaic of features, the various galliospids and acanthodians that fill out the picture of Silurian marine life, have pushed back the dates for key evolutionary innovations and revealed that the diversification of jawed vertebrates was already well underway by the early Silurian. These Chinese localities benefit from exceptional preservation conditions that captured not just the hard parts of these ancient fish, but also traces of soft tissues and delicate anatomical details that are usually lost to decay. Other Silurian windows dot the globe, each offering its own perspective on this ancient world. Estonia preserves exceptional stromatoporoid reefs in the Katri biostrome. The Czech Republic has yielded some of the oldest Cooksonia specimens, pushing back the record of vascular plants on land. Australia contributes Baragwanathia, that controversially complex plant that appears in rocks too old for its level of sophistication. Each locality adds another piece to the puzzle, another fragment of evidence that helps us reconstruct the Silurian world in ever greater detail. If you could somehow visit all of these sites, walking the shores of Gotland, exploring the quarries of Wisconsin, examining the outcrops of Ludlow and Stonehaven and Chongqing, you would begin to see the Silurian not as a single, uniform period, but as a dynamic and changing world. The seas were different in different places, the communities varied from reef crest to deep basin, and the land itself was transitioning from barren rock to something new. The windows we have are scattered and incomplete, but together they allow us to glimpse a world that existed long before anything resembling a human walked the earth, a world that set the stage for everything that would follow. But the Silurian could not last forever. No geological period does, and as the millions of years accumulated, the world was changing in ways that would bring this chapter of Earth history to a close and open a new one in its place. The Silurian did not end with a bang. There was no asteroid impact, no supervolcanic eruption, no sudden catastrophe comparable to the extinction that had ushered the period in. The transition from the Silurian to the Devonian was a gradual affair, a slow shifting of conditions that unfolded over millions of years rather than the geological instants that mark some of Earth's more dramatic boundaries. Sea levels fell, climates shifted. The great reef systems that had flourished through the middle of the period began to change in character, their communities reorganizing in response to conditions that were subtly but persistently different from what had come before. Life continued, adapted, and eventually crossed a threshold that geologists would later recognize as the beginning of a new chapter in Earth history. The Pseudoli epoch, the final stage of the Silurian, takes its name from a locality in the Czech Republic, where rocks of this age are particularly well exposed. It lasted roughly 3 million years, a brief coda to a period that had already spanned more than 20 million. And during this time, the trends that would define the Devonian were already becoming apparent. The shallow seas that had flooded continental interiors were retreating, exposing land that had been submerged since the early Silurian, or even longer. Where warm, shallow waters had once supported diverse marine communities, mudflats and coastal plains were emerging, new terrestrial environments waiting to be colonized. The retreat of the seas left behind something unexpected in the low-lying basins of the continental interiors. As seawater became trapped in shrinking pools cut off from the open ocean, evaporation concentrated the remaining water until it became saturated with dissolved minerals. Salt and gypsum began to precipitate out of solution, accumulating in thick layers on the floors of these evaporating basins. The Michigan Basin, which today underlies much of the state of Michigan and extends into surrounding regions, accumulated evaporite deposits hundreds of meters thick during the late Silurian, the compressed remains of an inland sea that slowly dried up as global conditions changed. Similar deposits formed in basins stretching from West Virginia to Ontario, a belt of ancient salt that miners would exploit hundreds of millions of years later. These evaporite deposits tell us something important about the climate of the late Silurian. Evaporation can only exceed precipitation in relatively arid conditions when the sun removes water from a basin faster than rivers and rainfall can replace it. The formation of thick evaporite sequences suggests that the regions where they accumulated experienced prolonged periods of dryness, perhaps seasonal droughts or longer-term shifts toward more arid conditions. This does not mean the entire planet was drying out. Climate is always regional, and conditions that produced evaporites in one basin might have had no effect on ecosystems thousands of kilometers away. But it does suggest that the warm, wet, reef-friendly conditions that had characterized much of the Silurian were giving way to something more variable. The Caledonian Mountains, still young and high from the collisions that had assembled Laurussia, were eroding rapidly during this time. Rivers swollen with sediment poured down their flanks, carrying sand and gravel and mud toward the coastal plains and shallow seas that remained. This sediment accumulated in thick deposits of red and brown sandstone, the old red sandstone that would give the supercontinent one of its names. The red color came from oxidized iron, rust essentially, a sign that these sediments were deposited in terrestrial environments where oxygen was abundant and conditions were very different from the anoxic basins that had produced the black shales of the earlier Silurian. If you had been able to stand on the shores of late Silurian Laurussia and look inland toward the mountains, you would have seen a world in transition. The peaks on the horizon were still impressive, though already lower than they had been a few million years earlier, their summits worn down by the endless work of frost and rain. The rivers flowing toward you carried loads of reddish sediment, spreading it across floodplains where the first vascular plants were beginning to establish themselves in something other than coastal wetlands. The air was breathable, the ozone layer functional, and the ultraviolet radiation that had once made the continents sterile was now merely a manageable hazard rather than an absolute barrier to terrestrial life. The marine world was changing too, though the changes were less dramatic than what was happening on land. The great reef systems of the mid-Silurian continued to function, but their composition was shifting as some groups declined and others rose to take their places. Several minor extinction events punctuated the late Silurian, brief intervals of elevated disappearance rates that pruned some lineages while leaving others untouched. None of these events approached the severity of the mass extinction that had ended the Ordovician, but together they contributed to a gradual turnover in marine communities that would accelerate in the early Devonian. The fish were diversifying through all of this, relatively unaffected by the environmental changes that stressed some invertebrate groups. Jawed fish were becoming more common, their descendants spreading into new habitats and experimenting with new body plans. The placoderms were on the rise, their armored forms growing larger and more diverse with each passing million years. Acanthodians swam in both marine and freshwater environments, their spiny fins and large eyes giving them an appearance that was beginning to look almost modern. The stage was being set for the Devonian, the period that would come to be known as the Age of Fishes, when jawed vertebrates would finally achieve the dominance that had eluded them in the Silurian. On land, the colonization that had begun with Cooksonia and the first arthropods was gaining momentum. Plants were spreading inland from their original beachheads in coastal wetlands, following rivers and streams into the continental interior. They were still small, still simple, still confined to moist environments where their lack of true roots would not be a fatal limitation, but they were present, and they were diversifying. And the ecosystems they supported were becoming more complex with each passing epoch. By the end of the Silurian, the continents were no longer truly barren. They were green at the edges, touched by life in ways that would have been impossible just 20 million years earlier. The Silurian had lasted approximately 24 million years, a relatively brief span compared to some geological periods, but long enough for profound transformations to unfold. The world that emerged from the Ordovician extinction had been impoverished and traumatized, its ecosystems simplified by catastrophe, its survivors struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of the second worst mass extinction in Earth's history. The world that passed into the Devonian was something entirely different, richer, more complex, fundamentally transformed by innovations that would echo through the remaining 400 million years of the Phanerozoic. What exactly had the Silurian accomplished? What was different about the world at the end of this period compared to its beginning? These are the questions we must answer as we approach the conclusion of our journey through this ancient chapter of Earth history. 24 million years is not a long time by geological standards. The Ordovician before it lasted 45 million years. The Devonian that followed would span 60 million. Even the relatively brief Cambrian managed to stretch across 53 million years before giving way to the next chapter in Earth's story. By these measures, the Silurian was a short period, a transitional interlude between the catastrophe that ended one age and the explosive diversification that defined the next. And yet in those 24 million years, the Silurian accomplished transformations so fundamental that their effects are still visible in the world around us today. Consider the jaw. Every time you eat, every time you speak, every time you smile or frown or yawn, you are using a structure that first appeared in the Silurian seas. The gill arches that bent inward and articulated into that first primitive jaw set in motion an evolutionary cascade that would produce every jawed vertebrate alive today. More than 60,000 species of fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including the species that is listening to these words. The transformation seems almost mundane when described in technical terms, a simple repurposing of skeletal elements from one function to another. But the consequences were anything but mundane. Jaws made possible active predation, precise manipulation of food, the development of teeth specialized for different diets, and eventually the complex vocalizations that allow human beings to communicate through speech. Without the innovations of Silurian fish, you would not have a face as you know it. Consider the land. Before the Silurian, the continents had been essentially lifeless for 4 billion years, their surfaces scoured by ultraviolet radiation and devoid of anything more complex than microbial crusts. By the end of the Silurian, vascular plants had established themselves in coastal wetlands, their stems rising toward the sky, their spores drifting on the wind. Arthropods had followed them, breathing air through spiracles, hunting and scavenging in the thin soil that was beginning to form from the weathering of rock and the accumulation of organic matter. These pioneers were small and confined to moist environments, nothing like the forests and grasslands that would later cover the Earth. But they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. Once life had established itself on land, it would never retreat entirely to the sea. Consider the ozone layer. The atmospheric chemistry that made terrestrial colonization possible reached its critical threshold during the Silurian, when oxygen levels rose high enough to generate and maintain an effective shield against the sun's most damaging radiation. This invisible transformation, undetectable to any organism living at the time, was arguably the most important single change of the entire period. Without stable ozone, there would be no land plants, no terrestrial arthropods, no amphibians crawling onto mudflats in the Devonian, no dinosaurs, no mammals, no human beings pondering the history of deep time. The Silurian atmosphere made the modern world possible in a way that is difficult to overstate. Consider the reefs. The stromatoporoid coral reef systems that flourished in the Silurian represented a quantum leap in the complexity of marine ecosystems, three-dimensional structures that created habitat for thousands of species and generated biodiversity that spread far beyond their physical boundaries. These reefs were not merely collections of organisms living in proximity. They were integrated communities, ecosystems with complex food webs and symbiotic relationships and feedback loops that maintained stability over millions of years. The reef-building traditions established in the Silurian would continue through the Devonian and beyond, eventually giving rise to the coral reef ecosystems that remain among the most biodiverse habitats on the modern Earth. Consider the continents themselves. The collision that formed Laurussia during the Silurian was a critical step in the assembly of Pangaea, the supercontinent that would dominate Earth's geography for the next 200 million years. The Caledonian Mountains that rose from that collision would erode into the sediments that preserved the fossils we study today, while the suture that joined Scotland to England would be walked by human beings who had no idea they were crossing a boundary that once marked the edge of an ocean. The geographical transformations of the Silurian set patterns that would influence climate, ocean circulation, and the distribution of life for hundreds of millions of years into the future. These legacies are not abstract historical facts, relevant only to scientists studying deep time. They are present realities, woven into the fabric of the modern world in ways both obvious and hidden. The petroleum that powers transportation and industry originated in Silurian black shales. The limestone that builds our cities and paves our roads is often composed of Silurian reef organisms. The salt that preserves our food and melts ice on our winter roads was deposited in evaporating Silurian seas. The very body you inhabit, with its jawed mouth and air-breathing lungs and vertebrate skeleton, carries the inheritance of innovations that first appeared in fish swimming through waters that vanished 400 million years ago. If you were to somehow meet your Silurian ancestors, the tiny jawed fish that were just beginning to diversify, the minuscule arthropods that had recently crawled onto land, you would not recognize them as relatives. They would seem utterly alien, creatures from a world so different from your own that no common ground could possibly exist. And yet the connection is there, written in your DNA, expressed in your anatomy, implicit in every breath you take and every word you speak. You are a Silurian creature, separated from those ancient pioneers by 400 million years of evolution, but linked to them by an unbroken chain of descent that stretches back through deep time to the warm, shallow seas where the foundations of your existence were first laid down. The Silurian gave us jaws. It gave us land. It gave us the atmosphere that makes terrestrial life possible and the reefs that anchor marine biodiversity. It gave us the continental configurations that would shape the course of evolution for eons to come. In 24 million years, a brief moment in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth, this quiet period accomplished transformations that would echo through every subsequent chapter of the story. And now that story approaches its end, at least the portion of it that concerns the Silurian. The seas are retreating, the mountains are eroding, the world is changing in ways that will soon carry it beyond the boundaries of this particular period. But before we let the Silurian pass into the archives of geological time, let us return one final time to that ancient world, to stand on its shores and watch the sun set over seas that no longer exist, to say goodbye to a chapter that gave us so much of what we are. 444 million years ago, the oceans died. We began this journey in the aftermath of catastrophe, standing on the shores of an empty sea, watching the waves roll in across continental shelves that had been stripped of most of their inhabitants. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction had erased 85% of marine species, collapsing food webs that had been building complexity for hundreds of millions of years. The survivors huddled in refugia, their populations reduced to shadows of what they had been, their future uncertain in a world that seemed to have turned against them. If you had been there, watching the clear water lap at barren rocks, you might have wondered whether life could ever recover from such a blow, whether the seas would remain empty forever. They did not remain empty. Within a few million years, the survivors had begun to spread, filling the vacant niches with their descendants, rebuilding the ecosystems that catastrophe had destroyed. The recovery was not merely a restoration of what had been lost, it was a transformation, a reimagining of what marine life could be. The endemic faunas of the Ordovician gave way to cosmopolitan communities that spanned the globe. The modest reef systems of earlier periods were replaced by towering structures of stromatoporoid and coral, living architectures that stretched for hundreds of kilometers along continental margins. The armored, jawless fish that had scraped a living from the seafloor were joined by new forms with hinged mouths and grasping teeth, predators that could bite and tear in ways that had never been possible before. And then came the land. For 4 billion years, the continents had been waiting, their surfaces sterilized by radiation, their rocks unweathered by roots, their silence unbroken by the movement of any creature more complex than a bacterium. The Silurian changed that. The ozone layer stabilized, creating an invisible shield that made the surface survivable for the first time in Earth's history. Tiny plants crept up from the water's edge, their vascular tissues carrying moisture into stems that rose toward the sun. Arthropods followed, breathing air through spiracles, leaving tracks in sediment that would become stone. By the end of the period, the margins of continents were touched with green, fringed with the ancestors of every forest and meadow and grassland that would ever exist. The world that emerged from the Silurian was unrecognizably different from the world that had entered it. Continents had collided and merged, raising mountains whose eroded roots we still walk upon today. Fish had developed jaws, setting in motion the evolutionary cascade that would eventually produce every vertebrate with a face, every shark and salmon, every frog and lizard, every sparrow and elephant, every human being who has ever lived. The architecture of marine ecosystems had been rebuilt from the foundation up, creating patterns of reef development and community structure that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. And life had established its first permanent foothold on land, a beachhead that would expand until the continents were covered with organisms in densities and diversities that the Silurian pioneers could never have imagined. 24 million years. In the vast sweep of Earth's history, it is barely a moment, a single breath in a life that has already lasted 4 billion years and will continue for billions more. And yet that moment changed everything. The Silurian was not a dramatic period, not an age of mass extinctions or explosive evolutionary radiations that capture the popular imagination. It was quieter than that, more subtle, a time of patient reconstruction and careful innovation. But the work it accomplished laid the foundations for everything that followed. You carry the Silurian within you, the jaw that shapes your words, the lungs that breathe the air, the vertebrate body plan that supports your every movement. All of these trace their ancestry to innovations that first appeared in fish and arthropods, navigating a world that was just beginning to recover from disaster. When you walk through a forest, you are walking through the distant legacy of Cooksonia and its kind, the tiny plants that first proved terrestrial life was possible. When you watch the sun set over the ocean, you're watching light fall on waters whose ecosystems still carry the structural signatures of Silurian reef communities, patterns of organization that have persisted through 400 million years of change. The Silurian asks nothing of us. It does not demand that we remember it, does not require our attention or our gratitude. The creatures that lived in those ancient seas had no conception of the future they were building, no awareness that their struggles and adaptations would echo through deep time to shape a world they could never have imagined. They simply lived generation after generation, doing what life has always done, persisting, adapting, filling every available niche with the endless creativity of evolution. And in doing so, they gave us the world we inhabit today. The hour is late now, and the journey has been long. We have traveled through 24 million years of Earth's history, from the empty seas of the post-extinction world to the green-fringed continents of the late Silurian. We have watched as reefs rose from the seafloor and fish developed jaws. We have seen the first plants colonize the land and the first arthropods follow them, breathing air for the first time in the history of animal life. We have stood on shores that no longer exist, looked up at skies that have long since changed their chemistry, imagined ourselves into a world so distant that even the continents have moved thousands of kilometers from where they were. And now it is time to rest. The Silurian seas are quiet tonight. The waves roll in across the continental shelf with the same patient rhythm they have kept for millions of years, the same rhythm they will keep for millions more. Somewhere out in the darkness, a stromatoporoid reef is growing one thin layer at a time, adding its small contribution to a structure that will take thousands of years to complete. Crinoids sway in the gentle current, their feathery arms filtering particles from the water. A trilobite settles into the sediment, tucking itself into a protective ball as the light fades from the shallow waters above. On the shore, the first plants stand in silence, their simple stems catching the last glow of a sun that has already set. Somewhere among them, a millipede moves slowly through the damp litter at their base, its many legs carrying it on a journey whose destination even it does not know. The land is quiet. The sea is quiet. The world breathes slowly, in and out, the ancient rhythm of tides that have been rising and falling since long before any creature existed to notice them. You have traveled far tonight through time and space, through the deep archives of a planet that has been keeping records for 4 billion years. The Silurian has shared its secrets with you, its reefs and its fish, its plants and its arthropods, its mountains rising and its oceans closing. These are not just facts from a distant past. They are part of your own story, chapters in an autobiography you never knew you had, written in stone and preserved in the very structure of your body. Let them settle now, these ancient memories, these glimpses of a world transformed. Let them drift down like sediment through quiet water, finding their place in the depths of your mind where they can rest undisturbed. The Silurian is patient, It has waited 400 million years to tell its story. It can wait a little longer while you sleep. The seas are warm and shallow. The reefs are growing. The first green shoots are reaching toward a sky that has finally learned to protect them. Somewhere in those ancient waters, your ancestors are swimming, their tiny jaws opening and closing, their small bodies carrying the seeds of everything you will become. They do not know you yet. They cannot imagine you, but they are there, living their lives. And through them, through the unbroken chain that connects their world to yours, you are there too, waiting to be born. The light is fading now. The Silurian sun is setting over seas that stretch to every horizon. The water turns from blue to gold to deepening purple, and the first stars are appearing in a sky that looks almost like the sky, you know. The same stars burning in the same darkness. The same ancient light falling on a world that is slowly becoming the world you call home. Rest now. The journey is complete. The Silurian passes into memory, into stone, into the long silence of deep time where all things eventually go. But what it built remains. What it gave us remains. The jaws and the lungs and the green living land. These are its gifts to you, carried forward through 400 million years of change, waiting for you whenever you wake. The waves are gentle, the water is warm, the world is at peace. Sleep well, child of the Silurian. Good night.